Welcome to Chatham House. It's lovely to have all of you joining us this evening in London, this afternoon in Washington and New York, and across the world to a very special, very unusual meeting. And it's very special because we're here really not only to talk about the United States, Britain, Turkey, France, Iran, and the world, and especially about Britain's role in the world, and most especially about Britain's diplomats and one of Britain's finest diplomats. But we're here also to engage two very experienced, accomplished, and great thinkers and speakers on the United States, one in Washington and one based here in the UK. I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the US and Americas program at Chatham House. I should say before I introduce our guests that we are on the record this evening. And so after we've listened to this conversation, it will be really wonderful to hear your questions and your comments, and you will be recorded, and we hope very much to share this recording. So we welcome your engagement a great deal. Our honored guest this evening, Sir Peter Westmacott, is known to all of our audiences at Chatham House. He is a friend of Chatham House over a very long time, and he is currently senior advisor to the US and the Americas program. I consider him one of our greatest supporters on every level, and I'm very grateful for his efforts. He is, as you know, he was previously the British ambassador to Turkey, to France, and to the United States. And he spent the years 2012 to 2016 in the United States. Today is a really special day because the book that we are here to discuss this evening, they call it Diplomacy, 40 Years of Representing Britain Abroad. You can see it just behind Peter to the left. It's actually published today. So it's not very often that you get to celebrate a book on the day that it's actually been published. And I have to say, from my point of view, it's wonderful to be able to talk about diplomacy after January 20th. So there's so many good things about this particular event. But 40 years of a very distinguished diplomatic career, and the stories and the telling in the book is really quite remarkable, and I encourage you to read it. We're very, very lucky, Jon, to have you. We have Jon Sopel, doesn't need an introduction to a Chatham House audience. Jon has been telling us about the world for more than 30 years at the BBC. He's previously been the Paris correspondent. He was there before Peter was ambassador to France. And then Jon and Peter overlapped in Washington for a few years. Jon, of course, is the BBC's North America editor and is currently in Washington and has a lot to cover. But they obviously worked together and came across each other quite a lot in the last 2 years of President Obama's time in office. Jon also has recently published a book. You can see it if you look behind his left shoulder. Unprecedented Politics, Pandemics, and the Race That Trumped All Others. And that was published just last month. So it's quite a wonderful opportunity for all of us. Thank you, Jon. Thank you, Sir Peter. And we'll turn it over to you, Jon.
Well, Leslie, thank you very much indeed. And to all of you, good evening or good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're in. I'm in Washington, DC at the moment. And before I get to questions to Peter, I've got to say that I hold him responsible for perhaps the worst piece of parenting that I have ever been involved with, which took place on the tennis court of the British Embassy in Washington, where one of the other people playing was a very senior national security advisor to President Obama. And I think there was a bit of a debate going on about whether Britain should maintain 2% of its GDP on defence spending. It was a fascinating conversation. For me, a journalist, this was manna from heaven. And I noticed that my phone is ringing by the side of the court, and it's my daughter. And I say, "Is everything okay, darling?" And she's in floods of tears and says, "I've just crashed the car." I said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." I said, "I'll call you later." And I put the phone down on her because I wanted to go back to the conversation with Peter. He was a brilliant diplomat in Washington, and I know that excellence was there in Paris and in Turkey. And the stories in this book are vivid and come to life and just go to show how close he was to the seat of power. I always think the best books are those where you've got something to get off your chest. And this is a book, Peter, where I feel you have got something to get off your chest. So why did you write it?
Well, John, thank you for those kind words. Leslie and Anna from Chatham House, thank you so much for putting this all together. And thank everybody else for tuning in. It's extremely kind of you to show such an interest in this amateur finally writing a book. Why did I write it? Well, when I sat down and thought about this, I wasn't really very keen. I wasn't sure there was much to say, but the more I thought about it, the more people nudged me and said, Peter, you've got stuff to put down in writing. We want to hear the story. I thought about it and concluded that I did want to say something about what a diplomat does, because most people think that they just sit there drinking champagne, eating Ferrero Rocher chocolates. I did want to say a little bit about whether diplomacy achieves anything and whether we still need them in an era of instant communications between capitals, while prime ministers and presidents and so on talk to each other directly. And I also, towards the end, began to say to myself, you know what, there is stuff that British diplomacy and even perhaps former diplomats can do to help the United Kingdom rediscover its global role, having done Brexit, having been, if you like, off the stage of foreign affairs for the last 4 years, and now settling down and working out what it wants to be in the future. And when I was in touch with John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State when I was there, John, when President Obama was there, he's now the envoy for climate change, which is a pretty important job, if we can put it with some understatement there. He said, he roared with laughter when I told him I was going to call it diplomacy, because he recalled his first press conference with Boris Johnson, when Boris Johnson was Secretary of State, and he paid him a compliment, and Boris was rather kind of embarrassed and shuffled his feet and mopped his hair around the place. And he said, Boris, they call it diplomacy. And so he was rather pleased to see that I'd plagiarized his comment unwittingly and made that the title of my book.
You say in the introduction, my experience has been the exact opposite of the view of those Brexiteers who hold that being part of the European Union caused the UK to surrender its ability to conduct its own foreign policy, and that only with Brexit would we be able to rediscover a global role. And you talk about the achievement of diplomacy. People are skeptical. You know, it's I'm sick of experts comment. What did you bring? What do the diplomats bring that Britain would be poorer without?
Well, there's kind of two halves to your question, John. The first half, I think, is related to Brexit, and am I right or am I wrong in thinking that it was essential to leave Brexit in order for Britain to have a voice that mattered in the world? And I think the answer to that is that at the heart of the European Union, one of the three major players, if I can say that without causing offense to friends in other countries outside France and Germany, the UK, working closely with those partners and the experts in those places, could make a real difference. We called it informally the E3, the European Three. We worked with plenty of the other Europeans on different issues, but on issues like trying to stop Iran developing a nuclear weapons program, those European capitals working together made a big difference. And on a number of issues like NATO and Western security, enlargement of the European Union, there were a whole range of issues, not least because Britain and France were the two countries in Europe which had a genuine military capability where we could do a lot of stuff together. And I worried that outside the European Union, the United Kingdom all by itself would have less influence and that its voice would count for less. So that's what lay behind that first comment. But your second question, what do we actually do? What difference do we make? It depends a bit where you are. Quite often in a country which is not in the headlines all the time, you will find that a foreign ambassador, by virtue of having a relationship with this or that government, president, military leader, civil society, can make a difference to a country which is going through a process of evolution or change. We had a British ambassador who was extremely close to Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar at a critical moment of that country's political evolution, for example. And in my own case, if I was trying to say, well, what did you manage to achieve during all those years that you were living in those grand houses? I like to think that in the early years of this century, shortly after the AKP came to power in Turkey and then Prime Minister, now President Erdogan, was there, the fact that the UK was the one European country pushing for Turkey to have the right to join the European Union, if it met the standards, if it met the criteria, was instrumental in promoting change and respect for the rule of law and civil rights, eradication of torture, end of death penalty, all those different things. And I think that we did make a bit of a difference there. In a country like the United States, I think it is harder for a foreign ambassador to make a real difference, because capitals talk to each other, because the United States is, in diplomatic terms, the most important country in the world and will often do what it wants to do, though the rest of us obviously try hard to persuade them to work closely with and consult their allies before they take critical decisions. But in a particular case, I would say that, false modesty apart, going up onto Capitol Hill and talking to hundreds, literally, of members of Congress, dozens of senators, one-on-one, sometimes in groups at others, sometimes on my own, sometimes with my Russian, French, German, Chinese colleagues, we actually did quite a useful job, not only on behalf of our own governments, which had signed the agreement to stop Iran developing nuclear weapons, but also on behalf of the Obama administration, because they had a lot of opponents on Capitol Hill who were being lobbied by Israel and a number of other countries which really didn't like this deal. And so using other government representatives who were also co-signatories of the deal actually made a difference to US foreign policy in their own country. And that was pretty unusual. And I think we all felt, the 5 ambassadors concerned, that we were making, dare I say, a bit of a difference.
Yeah, and presumably the other role, and maybe this is to express it in a more negative way, you stop accidents happening. I cited the example jokingly about my daughter crashing the car when we were talking about, Britain spending 2% of its defence.
I didn't stop that accident.
Yeah, no, but you found it. I know you thought it was a very important message that needed to be got through to Downing Street, that this was serious and they're not joking about this. And you could see more recently the British government toying with the Internal Markets Bill, and perhaps walking away from aspects of the Good Friday Agreement. And I suspect there was an awful lot of interaction between the embassy on Massachusetts Avenue and Whitehall, saying this would be looked on pretty dimly by an incoming Biden administration.
Well, you're right. And obviously, whereas I thought you were busy concentrating on your tennis, John, you had your ears flapping listening to our private conversations with our friends from the National Security Council. No, I do think that if an ambassador is doing his or her job properly, that one of the things that they are doing, apart from representing the country locally and understanding what's going on there and reporting back and flying the flag for Britain and promoting interests of commercial and individual Brits in trouble and all those sort of things, one of the most important things that an ambassador does is tell truth to power and tell what the people in number 10 or in the Foreign Office or the Treasury may or may not want to hear, which is the honest assessment of the guy or the lady on the spot about what's got to be done to best look after British interests in that country. And I know that sometimes the advice that I would give was not very popular. You could tell that either from the resounding silence in response to the stuff that I said, or from quiet comments about maybe you've a bit overstated this or not. But I never actually got a sense from anyone that they wanted me to shut up and stop saying what I thought was necessary in terms of how best to look after British interests in foreign countries.
I want to come to some of the details of Brexit and Trump and all the rest of it. There is a more general point that I want to talk to you about, which is you arguing there you've got to tell truth to power. One of the side effects of the rising populism that we see in so many countries around the world is that there is a hyper-partisanship, which seems to have even infected the Foreign Office, so that your successors' diptels, Kim Darroch's diptels, get leaked. They're on the Mail on Sunday. And the candid advice that he is giving the government, which is what I'm sure what you would say is what you are paid to do, is there. I wonder whether the next generation of diplomats, conscious of how easy it is for material to be passed into the public domain because the electronic circulation list can be enormous, will just think, I'm not going to speak truth to power. I'm not going to be as candid as maybe I should be, because I've seen what happened to Kim Darroch.
It's a very good question, John. And it wasn't just Kim, but my predecessor had a long, honest assessment about the incoming President Obama, which found its way, I think, into the Daily Telegraph. Kim had a series of diplomatic, whether they were cables or whether they were letters for a much more narrow distribution. I'm not sure. I think it was a mixture of both, reproduced, as you say, in the Mail on Sunday. This makes it really difficult for an ambassador to do his or her job. You're quite right. And when it happens, it's horrible when stuff that you've written in confidence suddenly appears in headlines with all sorts of gotcha commentary on it. And then it risks causing a great deal of offense to the government where you are accredited. And that makes your life very difficult. I think you simply have to try and find ways, if you're going to communicate something that's really delicate, of doing it in such a way that the risk is either zero, hopefully, or minimized. I mean, I remember a distinguished US senator friend of mine saying after he read the stuff about Kim, said, well, there's nothing there that we haven't already read in the Washington Post. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal was, of course, that President Trump didn't like it. And it became very difficult, in Kim's judgment, not for me to put words into his mouth, very difficult for him to stay on for the last few months before he was due to leave anyway, if senior people in the US government were not prepared to talk to him because the White House had vetoed all contact with him. And therefore he felt, you know what, I better go and somebody else should have a go at this. But in the longer term, you are right that if there's a serious risk of our stuff being leaked, then we will pull our punches and we won't be saying what we think needs to be said. And that's why the inquiry into the leak of Kim Darroch's diplomatic stuff is rather important. Was this a malevolent foreign power which had hacked the British diplomatic services communication system? Question mark, don't know. Was it a disgruntled former employee? Don't know. Was it somebody who thought for whatever reason that Kim was, I don't know, too Brexit skeptic and too pro-European and therefore they wanted him to be embarrassed? I have no idea what the truth is, but I do think it's quite important to find out because that's a very important message to others who are going to follow him into these equal positions of responsibility so that they know whether they can or can't report in confidence back to head office.
I want to talk a bit about Brexit, the rise of Trump, the rise of populism. Is there any element where you look back on your career, and we've seen the sort of populism of Erdogan in Turkey, and we've seen populism of the Marine Le Pen, and you know, when I was there, Jean-Marie Le Pen. We've seen the populism in Britain during the Brexit debate, where you are very scathing about the language that was used. Is there an element in which people like yourself, maybe journalists like myself, underestimated the sense of resentment that a lot of people felt, and that whilst we were good at communicating what was happening inside the Beltway in Washington, we didn't show as much appreciation of what was going out? And the same applies to in Westminster, people were aware of what was happening in SW1, but, you know, or in Paris, they didn't know what was going on beyond the periphery. I just wonder whether there is an element where there is a culpability for people not, people in a position of power and authority and influence, not to recognize the sense of disquiet and resentment there was in the wake of the financial crash in 2008.
I think you are right that we did not see these things coming. You know, there were many people, including in the British Conservative Party, for example, who thought that holding a referendum did not mean that the answer would be, let's leave the European Union. They actually thought that the process of holding it would be enough and people wouldn't actually go further because of the economic disadvantages were clear, they thought, to people in that party. In the United States, the beginning of 2016, which is when I left, I recall that the last political discussion I had with pundits and experts, not one of them thought that, actually one person thought Trump was going to be the Republican candidate and nobody thought he was going to be the next president. They thought that Ted Cruz was going to be most likely the Republican candidate and that the next president would be Hillary Clinton. So you're quite right that a lot of us didn't see what was going to happen. I think you're partly right that we failed to grasp the full extent of the resentment and the anger from those who were left behind and whose income stagnated in both Britain and America, but other countries as well, after the financial crash of 2008. I remember I used to go around boringly saying it is outrageous that not one banker has gone to jail, and that public servants and other people who are losing their jobs are paying the price for the bankers' laziness or corruption or fraud or whatever you want to call it, the mess that we all found ourselves in after 2007, 2008. And I think you're also right that we didn't fully grasp the extent to which people felt political elites, the word that was used, were out of touch with ordinary people. We didn't get, because we were laughing too loudly, if I'm really honest, we didn't get the fact that Trump's positioning of himself as a man of the people, whereas actually he was a plutocrat as much as anybody was, making tons of money out of working the system. But he somehow spoke the language of people who were fed up with political elites and felt they hadn't been listened to and life was not going well. And here was their guy. I mean, my view is that he wasn't their guy. He was looking after his own interests, but nevertheless, they bought the message. We say now, you know, there's a president who told 20,000 lies during the 4 years that he was there, according to the Washington Post. Trump supporters either don't care or they believe those lies, or they wanted to believe the ones that suited them. So yes, we did miss something there. And the fact that Donald Trump won more votes in the last election than any American presidential candidate ever has in history, except for Joe Biden this time round, and won 10 million more votes this time than he did last time, tells us something about his appeal, which I think a lot of us did not fully understand in advance. I think we do now, but we didn't then.
So I just wonder whether this book is written with a heavy heart, that the things that you have valued throughout your career, and to be honest, that I have valued throughout my career as a BBC journalist, which is there is such a thing as truth, there are facts, there is an objective reality out there, that science is, broadly speaking, a good thing because it helps us get vaccines when there are global pandemics. But there are people out there who do not tell the truth. And you in your book talk about Boris Johnson's relationship with the truth and Donald Trump's relationship with the truth. I just wonder whether this is a book written with a degree of sadness about where the world is now.
It's not written as the kind of grumpy old man in the peanut gallery.
You didn't say that.
No, you didn't say that. The world has gone to hell and you know, boo-hoo. No, it's not written with a heavy heart, John. It's written with a certain pleasure and pride that I'd taken 40 years, which I had an enormous amount of fun and was fortunate enough to have a very interesting career. But yes, towards the end, what I am saying is that I think it is very serious that the relationship between truth and fiction, honesty and dishonesty, has got blurred, that lies and truth are no longer as distinct as they were before, and that this has become the kind of common currency of a lot of politicians in a lot of different countries, and at times even in our own, in the United Kingdom, where we used to pride ourselves on speaking the truth and being straightforward and open and transparent. So I think there is some concern there, but I also, and it's linked to the rise of social media, the way in which lies can be spread extremely rapidly, and you know, it's gone around the world 10 million times before the truth, if you like, can sometimes catch up. And the fact that these mechanisms and the artificial intelligence and the algorithms have been clearly exploited, are being clearly exploited by malevolent governments in order to undermine truth, to sow discord, to upset democracy, and to try to ensure that alliances and institutions, which have done a pretty good job for the last half century of keeping the world safe and prosperous, that all that gets broken down, either destroyed because we've got iconoclasts and kleptomaniacs, if you like, in charge of other countries, or because of others who just want the existing order to be upended so that other countries can become more dominant. That bothers me. The way in which individuals and populism, and to some extent, the technology of social media has allowed truth to be thrown out the window, so that truth is whatever you want it to be, which is exactly the Vladimir Putin approach to public life and has been for donkey's years. He must be rubbing his hands with a degree of pleasure at the way that has happened. So yes, that does bother me, but I wouldn't say it's a heavy heart, because I think people are waking up to that now. And I do think there are opportunities now for leaders to get back not on the rails, so to speak, but to be aware of what's going on and to face up to those risks.
I want to talk about two other things before we open it up to audience who will ask far more sophisticated and intelligent questions than me. I want
The
to talk
Turks
about
have a wonderful phrase called estağfurullah, which means come off it, stop bullshitting.
You might say that I can't use words like that, but get in trouble. Brexit. Where do you see any sunny side? Do you see any advantage when you see what the European Union, some of the things they've said over vaccines and Britain and all the rest of it, that there'll be an awful lot of people who are thinking, thank goodness we're no longer part of the European Union and subject to all of that. So do you see any upside now that Brexit has happened?
I think in many respects, it's going better than people like me feared. In other respects, it's going exactly as badly as we thought it would. You know, the idea that there would be no non-tariff barriers and no obstacles to trade between Britain and the European Union, where we do 45% of our exports, you know, that has been shown very quickly to be nonsense. The fishermen are up in arms, whereas there was supposedly a fantastic deal for them. Trade across the channel is a problem. There are additional costs on trade in both directions between Britain and the European Union. We nearly had a nasty moment over a border across Ireland, but I think we managed to dodge that bullet, fortunately. But I think in many respects, it's gone well. I don't buy the argument that the United Kingdom has done well with vaccines against COVID because we left the European Union. We had already secured an opt-out from the European arrangement. We'd already secured opt-outs in the years gone by from the single currency and from the Schengen area, which was one of the reasons why people like me felt, you know what, we've got our cake and we're eating it already. We don't need to leave the European Union to look after our interests satisfactorily. But I do think that the UK has done a tremendously good job on the vaccines, not actually because we are not in the European Union, but we did choose not to go with the European Medicines Agency, which is one of the European institutions that used to be in London and has alas left, and dare I say it, seems to be working a little bit less well in its new home. So things are looking better than they might be, but it's not necessarily because we're no longer in the European Union. It just so happens that some things in this first few weeks of dark, cold London's January, I think have gone better than many of us feared they might have.
Look, we've had 4 years in America of America first and a certain isolationism. Some people would say that there were similar forces at play over the Brexit vote. Do you think, like the adverts that they used to put up for dogs, that a dog is for life, not just for Christmas, do you think Brexit is for life?
I think Brexit is for a very long time. I suspect that in 5 to 10 years, if it really looks as though economically we are falling behind, if supply chains are getting disrupted, if the cost of our exports to the European Union are not are too high and we're not competitive anymore, if food and other travel and individuals and people movement across the channel between Britain and the rest of the EU is becoming a real nightmare, if people get really fed up with the fact they can't take their dogs on holiday as they have been until now, if they can't send back stuff they buy by mail order from France or Germany or Italy, which they can't at the moment, but if they find that, you know, that sort of everyday life, which has been so easy and painless and seamless, if all that is just going wrong, and if in the bigger scheme of things, the UK is going down rather than up, and we haven't found that the free trade agreements that we're negotiating with third countries have made up for the loss of business that we're doing with the rest of the EU, then I think it is perfectly possible that in a few years' time, the United Kingdom could go back to the European Union and say, okay, guys, we've done this on our own, but we are ready to discuss a new arrangement. I'm not sure we would call it full membership, or if we did, it wouldn't be on the same terms. People would be very concerned still about issues of sovereignty and accountability and so on. But some of the things that we left for, like, you know, deregulation and sovereignty and getting rid of red tape, you know, dare I say it, they've got worse, not better, since we left the European Union. So there was a certain amount of dishonesty in the advertising that was going on. We were told also we were going to stay in the single market, we're going to stay in the customs union, and there would be you know, much fewer obstacles to trade. It's just not happened. A lot of that will settle down. You know, we haven't had massive queues of trucks in the Kentish countryside, which we feared we might have. That might happen in due course. So I think we wait and see how it goes. I think Britain being Britain will make the best of it. People will be pragmatic. They will try and find ways of ensuring that the UK remains closely engaged with European allies on the things that matter to us. And there's a whole lot that does, you know, police, law and order, cyber security, counterterrorism, defense, lots of that stuff I think will remain areas where we continue to work closely with our European partners. And then we'll see if in 10 years time or so, we've got a satisfactory arrangement which we're content with and the European Union is content with, then we'll stay as we are. But if it isn't working, I wouldn't rule out in 10, 15 years time, people having another look at this.
Does Britain still punch above its weight? I think it was Douglas Hurd who said that, but I should hesitate to say that to a diplomat because you'll correct me and say it wasn't Douglas Hurd, it was someone else. But
I think it was Douglas. Yeah. Do we still punch above our weight? Well, my concern is that on our own, even though we are still significant players in NATO, even though we're still one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, and even though we are, along with France, one of the only 2 European countries with a genuine military capability, and that we're very good, by the way, at things like cybersecurity and potentially even cyber offensives if we ever had to engage in that kind of activity. I fear that on our own, we will be punching less above our weight than we did. And I'm concerned that whereas we were a major voice at the heart of the European Union, an organization of 450 million people and 28 sovereign states brought together by common and shared interests, we were able to have a significant influence there. And I happen to know that in Washington, one of the reasons why the United Kingdom was regarded as a very important ally was not just all those things that we brought to the table in terms of defense and intelligence and cybersecurity and business. It was also that we were a very significant voice through which the United States could make its own opinions felt at the heart of the European Union. And outside that, the risk is that we will matter a bit less to others like the Americans, but not only the Americans, because we're all by ourselves, and that the other Europeans might think that we're less important because our voice may be less significant in places like Washington. So I don't think by any means that game is over and it's all terrible. It just means we're going to have to work rather hard and think very creatively to ensure that Britain post-Brexit is still going to be a significant player, but we cannot take it for granted. It's going to require hard work.
Okay, my final question to you is this one, and it's the best question that pollsters that are doing qualitative opinion polling ask, which is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
I'm still optimistic. Maybe because we got some vaccines, it's cheered us all up a bit, but I'm optimistic. I'm very proud to live in this country, to have represented it abroad for all this time. I think it's still got a huge amount going for it. And I think that the challenges which we've got to face around the world, we can do that. I feel more optimistic also that we've now got a different person as president of the United States. I think not having America there engaging with allies and telling the truth and standing up for the values and principles that we all treasure was a shame. And we've got a very decent new president in the United States, surrounded with a whole lot of, as it happens, old friends of yours and mine, who are key members of his administration. And I think there's a reasonable chance of sensible countries now coming together to address a lot of those post-COVID issues, but also some of the other big strategic questions that matter to us. And hopefully, using economic stimulus and so on to get back into addressing some of those questions that you started out by asking about, which is, why do so many people feel alienated and fed up and left behind by the results of the economic crisis of 12 years ago? Let's hope that the stuff that's being done now in America and elsewhere and building back better in the United Kingdom is going to make a real difference to those people too.
Peter, fascinating. We're going to take questions now. I'm just going to say that it's a phrase that we don't use in Britain often enough, but is often used here in the United States. Thank you for your service, sir.
Thank you, John, for yours. 30 years and counting, telling the world what's going on.
Exactly. Leslie.
How wonderful. I've really enjoyed that. And I have to say, as I'm listening to the two of you speak, especially in your last few remarks about the UK, it does feel like the United States and the United Kingdom are sort of on a parallel track in terms of the big questions. Is Brexit forever? Will Trumpism be a force in American politics forever? How influential will our countries be? What will their role in the world be? It does feel the parlor game that we've had for 4 years of what's worse, Brexit or Trump, feels like it's playing out in all sorts of ways in terms of the big questions that we're asking. We have a really extraordinary set of people with their hands up. So I'm going to go directly to them and in the order that they've put their hands up. So first
John will answer the questions.
First we have Dennis Mcshane. Dennis, if you're with us, it would be wonderful to hear your question. And if not,
sorry, demuted, yes. Thank you. It's been a nightmare evening because on the other computer, there's Emmanuel Macron, the Atlantic Council, giving this extraordinary tour d'horizon. And for Peter's benefit, as an ex-Turkish ambassador, the most swinging, detailed attack on Turkey I've heard from any world leader in the last couple of years. Really angry, really cross. So that's a problem, thank goodness, you don't have to worry about. So Westmacott versus Macron, who to go for? It's pretty hard. I just want to ask a techie question, Peter. In your excellent book, which everybody should buy, you start your career learning Persian, which is pretty difficult, and you wander around Iran, having come out of Oxford and done that excellent Foreign Office foreign language training course, which I benefited from just as a minister. They really are fantastic. But you make the point, everybody got Iran wrong. They didn't spot what was happening. They didn't understand the anger over Mossadegh. They didn't quite know who this Khomeini fellow was. Is there a part of the world today where you sense the guys in the big foreign ministries of the world just don't know what's going on and are missing out on something that's likely to get quite important soon?
Here, I will tell you that we have 18 people with their hands up. We won't get to all the questions.
Okay.
I will turn this over to you now.
I'll be pretty brief on that one because I haven't got a very good answer. But Dennis, thank you for turning off Macron for us. I know Jon Sopel is a big draw, but also any minute apparently we're going to have President Biden speaking at the State Department. But I gather he's put back the start of his speech by a quarter of an hour so that we could finish our conversation before everybody turns off on the BBC. Do you know, Dennis, I'm honestly not sure. I think there are countries which are a bit on the cusp. You know, we've all talked about Venezuela, which is not exactly on the cusp, but is in deep crisis. There are some questions which my Turkish friends raise about what's going to happen there over the next couple of years. Elections due in 2 years' time. And you've had one man and one party in charge for very nearly 20 years, which is a long time for anybody to be in charge of any country. I don't know what's going to happen in China. Most of us thought that economic progress was going to be accompanied by a political and social reform, whereas what we've actually seen is a retreat back towards a degree of one party, certainly, if not one man rule, and that's confounded many of the predictions, but who knows what's going to happen in the future, because one of the great things that we can, I think, engage on is that China is a part of the global economy and has every interest in remaining part of it. It's got trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars of US debt that it's invested in. It has no interest at all in the rest of the world not succeeding. It's a question of who are going to be the players, who's going to be pulling the levers. So I think there's some very big challenges, but I'm not going to give you a prediction of a country which is about to cause a big surprise and leave diplomats like me with egg on their faces. Because by definition, really, if I could see them coming, then it wouldn't be a surprise.
David Liddington.
Thank you. Peter, great presentation, really enjoyed that. Question, you attributed the rise of populism very much to the aftershocks of the 2008-9 financial crisis. And I just wondered whether some of this goes deeper than that. And we look at the world, we see digital revolution is upending so many assumptions about work and careers and livelihoods. We have China in particular asserting an anti-liberal, anti-democratic model of government as a role model. And particularly thinking with your knowledge of Turkey, but looking around the rest of the world too, you depicted, I thought very eloquently, some of the reasons for the rise of populism. Have you sort of worked out what are the things that might see it reversed? For example, in a country like Turkey or in a country like Hungary, where we have seen more conventional moves towards a liberal democratic model reversed?
I tell you what, I'm going to, while we get Peter back.
While Peter unmutes, then we'll come to Jon first.
I was just going to say that I think that journalistically, I've never felt the challenge has been greater to challenge some of these forces of misrepresentation, untruth, lies, whatever you want to call it, where we live in a world now where, you know, even in America, it's become so polarized that the TV channels either loathe Trump or adore Donald Trump. People don't tune in to be informed. They tune in to be affirmed. They just want to hear their own views echoing back to them. And if we can't get to the population and say, look, there is this thing called truth, and I think we've got a very serious problem. I will stop there in the hope that Peter is back so that I'm not waffling needlessly, because no one wants to listen to me.
Absolutely, I am back, and they do, John. But I'm awfully sorry, I lost David's question after he'd mentioned digital technology and China, and I wasn't sure quite what the point
I
was.
just think very quickly, Peter, thinking particularly of your understanding of Turkey, what is the way back when a country has succumbed to a populist movement or authoritarian movement? Could apply to Hungary, could apply to other places in the world. Have you observed, looking around, what might provide a route back to a more liberal, democratic, pluralist model?
I think it depends very much on what the country concerned would like and the internal dynamics. When I talk to Turkish friends about what's happening there, whether it's about the failed coup of July 2016, where 90% of Turks believe that the United States were behind it because Fethullah Gulen, who's living in exile in Pennsylvania, must be by definition a CIA agent. And even now they say, well, those of them who are not too happy about some aspects of governance in Turkey will say, well, we've got what we have because America chose to support radical Islam. And it's always somebody else's responsibility. And of course, that is one of the issues of being the United States of America. A lot of the world does believe that you are behind whatever happens in whatever country. We used to be blamed for it in certain parts of the world, as you know, David. So I think the first thing that people have to grasp, which is what I try to say to my friends, is, you know, please don't assume that Britain certainly, but America even more so, is either capable or willing to take those moves, or indeed is responsible for the last tsunami that happened in your country. It isn't like that anymore. It may have been in 1953 in Iran that foreign powers got involved and organized coup d'etat. It doesn't happen very often now, even if President Trump talks about doing something like that in Venezuela. It didn't happen. So the first thing they have to do in all of these countries is to work out for themselves what they want to do. That is why, if there is going to be political change in Russia, it has to be the Russian people who come onto the streets in support of Navalny or whatever they have to be doing, rather than other governments thinking that they can facilitate regime change. That is also why I believe President Trump's policy was profoundly wrong in believing that a policy of maximum pressure on Iran was going to produce regime change there. It wasn't. It simply strengthens the hardliners, and it provides a foreign bogeyman to blame for everything that they're doing wrong inside their own country. So I think the single most important thing is that people inside the country concerned, which requires change, have to begin to assume their own responsibilities, and they probably require a leader or two, possibly somebody who is, if you like, a victim, a kind of semi-martyr, somebody who's been attacked and poisoned and imprisoned, is a pretty good rallying point for people who feel that their own country is not being run in accordance with proper principles and freedoms and rule of law.
Peter, let me come to Steve Erlanger and Elena Lazarou, and then I'll come back to you and Jon before we go to Philip and Simon. So Steve Erlanger.
Elena, why don't you go ahead and I'll come after you.
Perfect.
That's very gentlemanly. Thank you. So good evening. I've been listening to you speak, which is incredible. It's almost like listening to history and thinking of the posts you had in the last decade of your service, all in major democracies, essentially, even though notwithstanding Turkey's current situation, but it is a big democracy. If I'm not mistaken, 3 major NATO allies, Britain excluded. So you've been grounded in critical places in the West, and at the same time, it was that decade where China was rising. So I would be very interested to hear from your perspective. What did you see changing in China's diplomacy in those years? What was the engagement with Chinese diplomats like? Did you see any change in the way they were projecting power? All these things that we're looking at today. How did it feel from those capitals? How did it feel when you were based in Ankara, in Paris, in Washington? Thank you.
Well, very briefly,
Peter, I'm gonna
yeah.
make you wait. I'm very sorry, but I'm gonna take Steve Erlanger and then Solly Ozel and then come back to you. Steve
Okay,
Erlanger.
thank you very, very much. I can't turn on my camera, but I am in Brussels. And Peter, congratulations on the book. It's wonderful news. Well done.
Thank you,
I'm
Steve.
hoping Brexit will allow it to arrive. We'll see. I'm waiting for Phil's book too. We'll see. But two questions. One, the ECFR has just done a bunch of polls that show a great loss of confidence among Europeans in the American system. Do you think it's broken? And do you think it's repairable, or is the damage permanent? And the second thing I have to ask you, being in Brussels, Mr. Hammond, Philip Hammond, said in an interview about Brexit that Brexiteers seem to think that they either had a choice of living in Belgium or in New Jersey, and they preferred New Jersey. And I wondered, since you've probably been there, whether you think that's a good place to end up. Thank you.
And then just one more from Solly Ozel, who's in Turkey.
Hi, I don't know why my video doesn't show, but at any rate, I'll have a very brief question which follows on Steve Erlanger's, and thank you for the presentation. To the extent that you believe Biden will be good news for not just the United States but the rest of the world as well, how curable do you think the Republican Party is? Is the only cure for it to break up so that it will have one normal party and a more proto-fascistic party that emerges out of it? And if how plausible is this? And what happens if it doesn't happen?
I'm sure that John will also have something to say about this, but Peter, over to you.
Let me have a quick go at those questions. Thank you so much. I'll try and be brief. On the first one, the answer is that during my career, I always enjoyed working with diplomats from all sorts of different countries, almost irrespective of what their origin was. If they had something to offer and we had a potentially productive relationship, then I worked with them. And certainly when I was working in Washington on the issue of Iran, I worked very closely with my Chinese colleague, as well as with my Russian colleague, and my French and my German colleague and my EU colleague. So over the years, I was able to work closely with Chinese colleagues. Of course, they were quite often on a shortish leash. And in more recent years, when I have spoken to Chinese diplomats about the issues which President Trump, let's give him the credit, has made us all wake up to about the way in which, in many ways, China has managed to exploit the benefits that it has as a so-called developing country, and with a very asymmetric approach to investment and trade and technology. They are still saying what they are told to say, which is, well, we all believe in Adam Smith and free trade, don't we? And it would be quite wrong for any country to try and put brakes on Chinese trade and investment, which is a somewhat disingenuous argument when you understand that until very recently, and to some extent still now, China doesn't actually apply the same rules to foreign investors and foreign trade and foreign technology as the rest of us do. So I think I'll just leave that point at that. On Steve's points, is the American system broken? I mean, I think you've had 4 years of a very, very different, constantly surprising kind of America, and then a president who broke all the molds and told lots of lies and upset an awful lot of alliances and international institutions in the way that I was talking about. Is it broken? Can it be fixed? I am still in my optimistic frame of mind. I think it can be. I think that the talented team which the incoming president has put together is very committed to rebuilding alliances, to strengthening rather than destroying the international institutions which have served the world pretty well, even if they need a bit of reform now. And they want to get back to the days. I mean, just look at Jen Psaki as the spokeswoman in the White House, of answering questions and telling the truth rather than insulting and obfuscating and lying, which is what we unfortunately had got used to. So I think in terms of culture, in terms of restoration of respect for truth, and in terms of engaging with international institutions and foreign allies and values, and I would like to think standing up to bad guys and standing up to those who are going to use cyber weapons to try to undermine institutions, businesses, democracy, and much else, I think we are in with a good chance of America, if you like, coming back. So let's be optimistic about that and see what happens. And linking that to Solly Erzel's question, I do not know what's going to happen to the Republican Party, but I watch at the moment as it is more or less tearing itself apart when it can't decide whether this or that congresswoman who has rather extraordinary views should or should not be expelled. I think she will be removed from membership of the committees on which she's seated at the moment. But what we're essentially seeing in the big picture sense is a Republican Party of which some members of the leadership still believe that it is so important for their survival to appeal to the Trump base that they will not stand up for what they know to be right, and they won't even accept that Trump has lost and that President Biden is now the president of the United States. So they're going to have to sort out amongst themselves what is going to happen to the Republican Party. Will it come together around the kind of principles and values for which it used to be renowned, or will it split? I don't know, but I think it's going to be a very interesting few months ahead. As for the Brexiteers, was it, Steve, was the question, they live in New Jersey or Jersey?
No, yes, well, exactly.
I didn't hear you clearly.
Well, Phil Hammond said he thought they had a choice between living in Belgium or living in New Jersey, and they preferred to live in New Jersey.
Okay, well, my question was because some of them, having spent large amounts of money on the Brexit campaign, actually then took their very substantial assets off to places where you don't pay tax and you don't actually have to deal with the economic disadvantage of Brexit. Some have gone to Monaco, some have gone to Jersey, some have gone to Cayman Islands, some have gone to different places. So I thought perhaps it was a comment about tax havens. It clearly wasn't. You know, there are some passionate believers in Brexit who are here in the United Kingdom and determined to make the best of it. Some of them will be a bit disappointed because many of the things that they anticipated simply haven't happened. And there's a lot more rather than a lot less red tape, as I was saying, and there's going to be more regulation rather than deregulation in many respects. But I think that, you know, it is a sadness to me that many of those who put very large sums of money into Brexit have fled the country since then, whether they've gone to Belgium or whether they're going to New Jersey or whether they're going to somewhere in the Caribbean. Not for me to say.
John, would you like to add a comment?
I'm going to do it like the 10 o'clock news where I'm told I've got 50 seconds to comprise the history of the world. So I'll try and do it in 50 seconds. Look, to Steve and to Solly's question, I think that people forget how close American democracy came on January the 6th. And on one level, it was the most astonishing thing I've ever reported on in my life, saying that I thought American democracy was at stake. And on the other hand, it was the natural conclusion of saying that the election had been stolen, that I won by a landslide, there was systematic fraud, even though 62 court cases later, he had lost 61 of them. And if you believe that America is a country of laws, the judges had ruled and said that the election was fair. And then there were backhanded ways to try to get the results changed. And I think it was a very dangerous moment. And you talk about the Republican Party, 140 Republican congressmen and women voted not to certify a result that had been announced by the Electoral College. That is astonishing. So yeah, Joe Biden is turning down the volume. He is lowering the temperature. Is something that America needs. But I think for people to think that, and I've just come from Capitol Hill this morning, so I had to get my congressional pass renewed. It is like a fortress there. There is a perimeter wire, and there are soldiers every 50 yards. America does not feel as it did before. And I still think that people who think everything's fine now are underestimating how serious it was on January the 6th and the wake of Donald Trump's defeat in the election.
I will just add one comment, not to disagree with you, but just to remind ourselves that they did know when they voted not to certify that enough other people would vote to certify, which doesn't make it okay and doesn't make it not dangerous, but it was a cheap vote.
But it shows the extent, as Peter was saying, the extent to which the Republican Party, the leadership, are still terrified of Donald Trump and the power that he wields and the danger he presents to them.
And next week will be quite something. Philip Stevens, Simon McDonald, Alistair Burt, and David Manning, and 3 minutes. We probably will go a few minutes over, but I might need to let John go because he might otherwise lose his job. Since
I may have to go.
Going to be speaking.
I want to hear what a list of panelists. I want to hear the questions.
John, we've been incredibly grateful to have you, but given that Peter has written this book, I do want to take these last 4 questions. So when you do need to slip away, we will be listening to what you have to say about our president or their president. Philip Stevens, over to you.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating, and thank you for the book, and also for helping me on my book, Peter. My question is about the relationship with the United States. That for 40 odd years, we had a foreign policy which basically rested on 2 pillars: the political security relationship with the US and NATO, and the economic and increasingly political relationship with Europe, the rest of Europe, through the EC and then the EU. We've blown up that European pillar. So is there not do you think there is a danger that we'll now basically try and put too much weight on the American pillar? And it's because it's an asymmetric relationship, it's always a danger that we're servants rather than partners. I mean, is there a real danger now that we actually become absolute servants of that relationship and of the US? And how do we balance it? How do we get to be like the French, who can say no, but still be treated as reliable and strong partners?
Come to Simon next.
Thanks, Leslie. Peter, you laid great emphasis, quite right, on talking truth to power. All good diplomats and civil servants do that. But what's your personal advice? What do you do when power is not listening? And second, very quickly, in Europe, people think that Trumpism is all about Trump. But what do you think are the elements that survive Trump, and who's likely to corral that, harness that in 2024?
John, do you want to have a final word before I come to Peter on those 2, and then I'll come to the last 2 questions?
Okay, I will have to go, but let me just, as a final one, to particularly what survives. I mean, I do think that the force of Trumpism is Trump, and I don't see that it passes on to Ivanka necessarily, and I don't think it passes on to Don Jr., and it certainly doesn't pass on to Eric. So I think that there will be people who will try to present themselves in the mold of Donald Trump, and you see that sort of Ted Cruz is going for that space, and the junior senator from Illinois is going for that space, Josh Hawley. They will try and do that. I think it is very difficult. I suspect that what you'll see is a decline in turnout if Donald Trump is not running in 24, and I think it's highly unlikely. I think it's that he will run. So I think that the Republican Party is in an existential crisis. Is it the party of Trump, or is it the party of traditional small government, lower taxes, all the rest of it that the Republican Party has previously been? And I think, you watch Kevin McCarthy, and he's walking a tightrope over what he does over Marjorie Taylor Greene, what he does over Liz Cheney. Who does he support? And he sort of seems to have trying to navigate a middle path, and that cannot hold.
Thank you. I agree.
Thank you so much. And Peter, congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
John, if you've gone by the time we finish, thank you so much.
Great pleasure, Peter.
Talk to you very soon.
Thank you, John. Peter.
Did you want to ask Alistair Burt?
I'm going to come to Alistair and David last. But
okay. Let me try quickly on those points. Philip's question: are we, in a sense, going to try and load too much into the basket of the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, given that we have, as he put it, but I couldn't possibly say that, blown up the relationship or the pillar of our relations with the European Union? It's very clear to me that the current Prime Minister in London has exactly the same concern that all his predecessors have had since, certainly since Winston Churchill, which is, I've got to have a very close relationship with whoever's in the White House. It was a little bit tricky at the beginning because he had clearly invested in the Trump relationship and wasn't particularly keen on any of the Democratic candidates. And he'd made a few rather rude remarks about leading Democratic figures in the United States. And of course, by the standards of a lot of people in the United States, especially Democrats, but not only Democrats, he had been an advocate of a policy, Brexit, which Americans thought was not good for Britain or good for Europe or good for America. So, all that stirred in with, one or two other doubts about was he the right sort of person to be Prime Minister, meant that it was going to be tricky. But I think he's got off to a very good start. The President has very graciously made a couple of early phone calls that always goes down well in London to the Prime Minister. And so that relationship is getting off to a good start. I myself have never really believed that a comprehensive free trade agreement between Britain and America is all that important. Symbolically, it's a very helpful part of life after Brexit, but the economists think that it's not going to make much difference to GDP or to trade over the next decade. And it's going to be really hard to negotiate because all the difficult issues like financial services and phytosanitary standards and chlorine washed chicken and beef hormones, Public Procurement Acts, Buy America legislation, and all these things are going to be really hard to resolve. So I don't worry, I don't think we should worry too much whether that's going to work or not. But we do need America to be very supportive of and the key player in NATO. We do need America to work with its allies in standing up to bad men and strong men and psychopaths and others. And that is very important. And we should certainly not minimize the importance of that relationship. Should we be more like the French? Well, let's be honest about this. At moments when the British Parliament wasn't too sure that it wanted the UK to join President Obama in taking military action in Syria, the end of August in 2013, the French were very quick off the mark to say, oh, but we're ready. We've got planes on the runway ready to fly. We are your oldest ally, and we too would like to activate our special relationship with the United States. So, France does things a little bit differently. And of course, it's a truism. You go back to Suez, the conclusion that France drew was never, ever rely on the United States again. And the conclusion that Britain drew was never do anything in foreign policy without having the Americans on your side. And that was a fundamental different strategic judgment that we all made at that time, which has influenced the way in which both those countries have functioned since then. But I think the little story I just tell about Syria suggests that in reality, the differences aren't all that great. So I think in terms of economic and other interests where we have potentially damaged our interests with Europe, we will be looking to the rest of the world with lots of free trade agreements and so on, including America. Let's hope that that works. I'm a little skeptical, I'm a little worried about it, as I have written in the book. But I think it is absolutely right to try to get the relationship with the United States in terms of all the defense and security issues and the strengthening of democracy and working together with like-minded to stand up to the bad guys. That must be a top priority. And that's not about putting too many eggs in one basket. That is about doing what is sensible, I think, for the interests of the Western world. Simon's great question, what if power doesn't listen? Well, as he knows every bit, probably better than I do, you've got a couple of choices. I mean, either you keep pounding away saying you have fundamentally got this wrong and you really must listen to my advice, but if they continue not to do so, you either just suck it up and make the best of it, or you have always got the option as a diplomat of resigning. Doesn't often happen. One or two left the British diplomatic service because they fundamentally disagreed with the decision to invade Iraq in 2003. And one or two moved on one way or another over the whole Brexit business because they just did not believe it was right and did not believe that the campaign to get Britain out of the European Union was conducted on an honest basis. And so they left government service. But at the end of the day, you either, if your advice is not accepted, you just make the best of it, or you say, you know what, I can't actually do my job, and this is either contrary to the national interest or contrary to my fundamental beliefs, and so thank you very much, but I'm going to move on. And it doesn't happen nearly as often as one might think, because it doesn't often turn out to be quite as stark as that. Usually the rejection of that advice is more nuanced than the black and white way in which I have just suggested. Trumpism after Donald Trump. The point that I keep in my mind is that had it not been for Donald Trump, the Republican Party might have made a clean sweep of the Senate and the House of Representatives on the 3rd of November. There's quite a lot of evidence that a lot of Republicans didn't hold their nose and vote for Trump. They didn't vote for him, but they did vote for their candidates in the Senate races and the House races. And from that, what I conclude is that the Republican Party is still, despite everything we've been saying about the Trump base, is still actually bigger than Trump. And there are a lot of people who are Republicans who would like to see him gone. They've signed on, many of them very reluctantly. Remember, during the primary campaign, most of them didn't want Donald Trump as their candidate, but he was very effective with his mean little nicknames about Lion, Ted, and Little Marco. Sleepy Joe didn't run as well. But those sort of things and the other language that he used worked quite well then. But it was him. This is not something that he's going to hand on to the children. And I think Jon Sopel is exactly right in making that point. But there is still a massive Trump base. And the question is going to be who in the Republican Party is going to be best equipped to tap into that base. I'm rather hoping that the red meat that they throw to that base will not be the same meat that Donald Trump has been throwing them, because I don't think it was good for America. I don't think it was good for the rest of us. And much of it was thoroughly dishonest. It wasn't even in the interests of those people who were voting for him, as I think the economic figures will show in the time to come. So I suspect it'll boil down to, first of all, the ending of the civil war within the Republican Party we've been talking about, and secondly, who will be the real leadership figure who assumes the mantle once Donald Trump has concluded that he's not going to come back for another 4 years in 2024.
Great comment, especially I think that last one. And of course, it's true at the state level too, right? The success
Yes.
of the Republican Party. But and people don't usually frame it that way. The Republican Party, did very well. It's bigger than Trump. It's not usually the frame that's put on it. Alistair, Burt, David Manning, Mark Lyle, Grant, and Priya. It'd be nice if we could get to those four if you have time, Peter. I know Susie thinks that you have time, so I think that has spoken. And Alistair, it's your turn.
Thanks very much, and I'll be brief. Transparency, first of all. Sir Peter was the ambassador in Washington when I was minister for North America, and accordingly, I know just how good he is, and I have had the pleasure of reading and enjoying his diptychs, perhaps more than many on the call. They're all well worth reading, I can assure you of that. Question, Peter, and it takes on slightly from where Simon was, but in a slightly different direction. Is there an endpoint to diplomacy with states that don't listen to us? I'm thinking particularly of the authoritarian states who I think see a weakened West, a weakened set of liberal democracies, and are already performing in a very unhappy way. And I suspect will continue to do so and test us out. And you know some of them quite well. Is there a point at which diplomacy simply runs out and you cannot do any more? Or is there never that point, and your job is to keep going no matter what the circumstances and no matter how awful some countries may be behaving in terms of their threats to others or human rights? I'm really interested in whether or not you feel there is an end point or whether you just go on. It's talking truth in a way to another power, and whether or not there is always a reason and a purpose for doing that. I'm just interested in that. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
David Manning.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Peter, can I take you back to Turkey? Do you think Turkey is on a one-way trip into authoritarianism domestically? And internationally, do you think it will remain a semi-detached partner of the West through NATO, or will it spin off into a different orbit? And how serious would that be for Western interests?
If it's okay, Peter, let me take two more and then we'll come back to you. Priya and then Mark Lyle Grant.
Hi, Peter. Lovely to hear you this evening. In the full disclosure, Passim, I should say that Peter was my boss for a number of years. So I don't know if that influences my ability to ask the question or his ability to answer, but we'll go for it. So my question, unsurprisingly, for Peter will be around the impact of tech. And so in a world where tech companies can actually have more impact on global dynamics than some governments, what does that mean for the way that diplomacy may need to change to keep pace?
And I'll come to Mark Lyle Grant and then Angie, and then Peter will let you answer as much as you choose. Mark Lyle Grant.
Thanks very much, Leslie, and thank you, Peter, for fascinating discussion. Peter was also my boss at one point in my career. I wanted to go back to the US political system, Peter, slightly wider. I mean, quite irrespective of the recent shenanigans, as someone who didn't serve directly in Washington myself, I've always found the very short electoral cycle, the politicization of the judiciary and the civil service, the role of money, the lobbyists, the interest groups, turns it into a fairly baffling version of democracy. I mean, do you think there is something more fundamental that doesn't really work in the American democratic system?
Angie Hunter.
It's myself and Adam here. We're sitting in our sitting room. I'm so pleased to see David and Peter and Susie and everybody we've seen. And thanks so much for that, Peter. It was really interesting, and everybody's questions, it was so wide ranging and very
Great to have you on the line.
Thank you. Anyway, my husband, who is going to be interviewing you on Sky News tomorrow, wants to pose a question to you, if that's okay. I don't understand why you can't see us, because we can see all of you. We've got all our cameras on. Anyway,
it's a very short question.
Adam, are you asking a question? Adam?
Just tell us more about Joe Biden, who you obviously knew so well.
That's a great question.
Wow.
That's a fabulous question. Is that the end of the question, Adam?
Yeah, that's it.
And Angie, nothing from you other than to introduce your husband?
No.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. Peter, you have some wonderful questions.
I am interested in, I think there's a whole new thinking going on about the civil service. And I think it's really great, Peter, that, you're entering in this debate. And I hope you have influence. I know that Lady Hayward is doing Jeremy Hayward's next week.
Yeah.
So
I just want to give you the quote from Joe Biden that Dennis went off to listen to. Joe Biden said, "America is back, diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy." There we are.
That's a fabulous quote. Let's hope it turns out to be true. Sir Peter, you have a long list.
I have a long list.
They're great questions, and take your time.
Yeah, they are great questions, and I don't want to try people's patience too much. Alistair's question, does diplomacy run out? I think it is an extraordinarily good question. I was thinking as he spoke of examples where we had, if you like, thrown in the towel and broken diplomatic relations with certain countries. There was one with Syria when the famous Mr. Hindawi tried to blow up an aeroplane with his pregnant girlfriend on it out of Heathrow. And very good airport security detected it. And we broke off relations with Syria as a result of it. There are other countries where we've temporarily suspended relationships with them. I think the answer is that when diplomacy runs out, either because you can't make a difference or because of some really egregiously bad behavior from another country, you probably do draw those conclusions and give up. But if you have a choice, and sometimes you don't because of the horrific nature of the actions, you need to say to yourself, is it going to make a difference? Does it help? And are you still going to be able to protect the interests of British subjects who are in that country? Because that is, after all, what taxpayers expect diplomats abroad to do. And if you give up completely, you don't necessarily still have that influence to wield. And sometimes, even when your influence in that country does not produce better behavior or greater respect for rule of law or human rights, sticking in there might be the best chance of it changing in due course. Last comment on this. One of the reasons why the United Kingdom has been able to engage with the United States over a number of years on Iran, quite apart from the fact that we have a shared interest in ensuring that there isn't a development of a nuclear weapons program there, is that the UK has had diplomats on the spot most of the time, not all of the time, for the last 40 years, whereas for all that time since the 1979 revolution, America hasn't had a single diplomat in Iran, and therefore, although it is the single most important other country that Iran cares about, for all the reasons that we all understand, doesn't have the expertise there to advise on, what is happening and what tactics work and what's going on in the country and what's the effectiveness of US or other policy. So I think you throw in the towel only very reluctantly and with your eyes wide open as to whether or not it's going to make a difference. David Manning's question about Turkey. My basic rule of thumb is that in almost any country, whether it's a democracy or another one, anybody who stays in power more than 10 years is risking it. They either become mad or bad or ill or are susceptible to some sort of coup d'etat, and they should, generally speaking, let somebody else have a go. And the two prime ministers in our own country who served for 10 years, both were removed by their own party and never lost an election. So maybe they too concluded that, or the system concluded that 10 years in power was long enough for any one person. Now, President Erdogan, extraordinarily gifted politician, has been there for almost 20 years. I think in the early years, very good progress was made in lots of different ways. I think one of the reasons why that progress began to stall was because, very sadly, after Turkey did the right thing and endorsed the United Nations plan for Cyprus, for resolving the territorial dispute between North and Southern Cyprus, the other side, if you like, the Greek Cypriots, turned down in a referendum the outcome which the Turkish Cypriots approved and which the Turkish government had reluctantly but finally did approve. And that has fouled up the whole relationship between Turkey and the European Union ever since. It is still a NATO country. I don't think it is facing in lots of other directions, but it is a country which is not at all reluctant to play the card of economic nationalism or to wrap itself in the flag or to indulge in foreign policy adventurism, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. Turkey is, the most important thing to say is that it is still a democracy. And ever since 1950, elections have happened in the normal way. In recent years, there has been controversy about whether some of the elections were as free and fair as they should have been. And we all know, or those of us who follow Turkey, that there was an occasion just a couple of years ago when the results of municipal elections were not to the president's liking, and so they were rerun. And actually, they then produced an even bigger victory for the opposition. So democracy in many respects, even if freedom of expression in the media, alas, is not quite as alive and kicking as it should be, democracy is still alive. And there are very significant elections taking place in 2023, if not before. So I think we should all reserve judgment on that issue until then. And we should take to heart, perhaps, what the president himself, Mr. Erdogan, has said, which is that he is re-embarking on a reform program, going back to many of the things that were going right for Turkey 15 years ago. And perhaps not coincidentally, these are commitments which he has given shortly after the election of President Joe Biden in the United States. So let's see where that takes us.
Peter, before you leave Turkey, I just would like to read out one comment. You won't need to answer it because you already have, but it's probably from a dear friend of yours, Mcshane, a retired ambassador, who writes, "Dear Peter, all your friends and colleagues in Turkey do remember your invaluable contribution through your exceptional professional services to the Turkish-British relationship, as well as Turkey's efforts to engage itself with the civilization project, namely the EU." And he goes on to ask about Turkey's future with the EU. I thought you might want to hear that comment.
Thank you. Well, I've tried to give some sort of a steer on that. Priya was asking about technology and diplomacy. And I think part of the answer is the same answer about technology and military capabilities. I think one of the mistakes that we have made with our big spending military budgets in many Western countries is that we were a bit slow on the uptake, particularly when we were warned by one or two Russian generals, maybe as much as a decade ago, that low-cost cyber offensive warfare was the way of the future, rather than expensive tanks and aircraft carriers. And cheap off-the-shelf drones with homegrown technology in many Middle Eastern countries have shown to be extraordinarily effective weapons of foreign policy. So I think the same does apply to diplomacy in a way that we have to adapt to technology, to communications, to social media, and to getting our messages across in lots of different ways. I'm not just saying that all ambassadors should spend their entire lives on Twitter. I don't think that is entirely the answer. But I think we do have to change the tools of our trade, if you like, to adjust to that new world in which we now live. I don't think that means that we should stop. We should give up on the idea of meeting people and making friends and explaining our own countries, our own cultures, our own priorities to other people. And I don't think it means that we should give up, from time to time going on television to make messages clear about your own country. But we do definitely need to adapt to the very different new world in which we operate. Mark Lyle Grant's question, I'm just trying to read my own notes. And yeah, I mean, great question, Mark. I think, and I touch on this a bit in my book, that American democracy has run into some pretty troubled times. My own view, and this is also the view of many of my Democratic political friends and maybe some Republicans in America, is the whole Citizens United decisions of the Supreme Court, which essentially unleashed unlimited amounts of money into the American political system, was actually a very destructive decision. My old friend, Senator George Mitchell, who was Senate Majority Leader some of the time when I was in Washington, described it as the greatest mistake, the greatest misjudgment the Supreme Court has made in its entire existence, which is quite forceful language. And I think that the way in which money and special interests are brought to bear in the electoral process is different to what happens in many other countries, and I think is not always a very healthy arrangement for democracy. And I think in many ways the fact that judges and attorney generals, as well as governors and senators and congressmen and presidents, are up for election and therefore susceptible to special interest groups lobbying them and wanting decisions to be taken in line with their interests rather than what is necessarily in the best interests of an individual state or country, then I think that is damaging to the whole democratic process. I also think it's a pity that as soon as you get elected to the House of Representatives, you are out there shaking the tin, raising money for your re-election campaign, because the entire House is up for re-election every 2 years. The Senate is every 6, and therefore 1/3 of it every 2 years. But half the time of congressmen is spent out there raising money. And I think that is a huge distraction from doing what is best for the country and what the country really needs. And at the moment, the potential for Congress to come together with the executive in order to try to get America back on the rails is enormous. I think actually Donald Trump himself contributed to the surprise result of the runoffs in Georgia by the way in which he tried to intervene in the democratic process illegally. And in the end, the Democrats won both, which was not expected. And now, as a result of a 50-50 in the Senate and with the casting vote in the hands of the vice president, you have got the potential for Congress and the executive to work together. And if ever there is a president of the United States who has experience and skill and the personality of engaging with those across the aisle from another political party, it is Joe Biden, because he has got many, many years of experience in doing that. Which is my little kind of segue into the other question from Adam, which is, tell us about Joe Biden. And the answer is that that's the kind of person, in my view, that he is. He is a very much a people person, more touchy-feely than some would like. We never had a problem with that, but fascinated by what makes other people tick. Always enjoyed going around the world, meeting people from other cultures, other civilizations. What is it they want? How do we reconcile our differing interests? What's the way forward? The bad joke in Washington at the time, when there was a real deadlock on Capitol Hill, was that they would threaten Republicans and Democrats that they would be locked up in a room with Joe Biden and not let out until they reached an agreement, because he would talk at them until there was an outcome. And that's one of his gifts. So I think he's somebody who is a conciliator, a consensus seeker. He's not a man with a huge ego. He is a man who has suffered immensely during many years of his life, and he understands how other people suffer and how that suffering needs to be alleviated. He is a man who is very Irish American. He is very Irish Catholic. That is one of the reasons why he and his team issued very sharp warnings to the British government about messing about with the Good Friday Agreement when it looked as though we might be about to break international law as part of the Brexit extrication process. And that came from the heart. But he's also a man who's got strong British roots, who is used to working with the United Kingdom. And I think the Prime Minister should be well pleased that he's had those early conversations with the new president. I think for the UK, there is bags of potential for engaging together with Biden and the Biden team to try to make the world a safer and more prosperous place.
Peter, you've really given us quite a tour and answered an extraordinary wealth of questions. It's really heartwarming to see so many people on the call, well over 160 still with us. And we've run quite long and quite late. And it's really fabulous to see the Westmacotts and the Nemezis, as well as, of course, Susie, who I know makes it all happen. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Susie. And thank you, of course, to Anar and Courtney, and to everybody for these really tremendous questions that are on record, and you will be able to take a look back at the answers, which were tremendously nuanced and really wonderful. Thank you, Peter. We'll read the book, and we'll look forward to the next conversation.
Well, Leslie, thank you. Thank you for questions. Thank you for everybody who signed up, and I hope we haven't sent you to sleep, but it was a great experience, and I'm very touched that so many of you have tuned in. And many of your colleagues and friends. Thank you.
Meet and clap.